Anyone that's been training for a long period of time has likely run into a point at which they've had an injury that's kind of slowed down their rate of progression or even their just ability to show up to the gym and train. And quite frankly, it's really annoying. There's nothing worse than being held back by your body and its capability. You know, your mind is saying yes, you've got goals that you want to tick off, but you're just being held back by the actual overall process of training because of pain. And yeah, there's nothing more annoying. So, you know, today I want to really talk about why we get injuries, because I honestly believe there's a lot that we can do to prevent them. I think there's a lot that we can do to control variables. And if we sort of understand what they are, we can reverse engineer it, or at least have systems in place that are going to allow us to reduce the chances of injuries over time. Now, with injuries, there's no way of ever fully predicting when you're going to have one, or there's no way of fully mitigating your risks. But, you know, as a physiotherapist and coming from a background outside of physio, you know, a little bit of my journey, I started off as a chef by trade. And I jumped into personal training. That was my big exit from cooking. And I first sort of started working with people, and I realized that if I got people in the right position, that I could get a lot out of them without actually really needing to add anything in. So what really started to sort of spark my curiosity, I guess, is understanding that, you know, if people are in the right position, contextually speaking to the exercise they're doing, it actually instantly improves their performance. Now, if someone's improving their performance, you could, you know, take a stretch sort of stab and say, well, they're probably doing things in a way that's conducive to long-term progress. Now, the further I sort of went on with this is I started to realize that most people failed in the gym, or most people had bad sessions or experienced pain or had poor performances purely because they were like fighting themselves. Now, I always use this analogy when I'm treating with people. There's only so much like tension your body can create, and there's only so much force that your body can create. And if you're in a position where let's just say you've got really, really tight sort of front of quads and legs, there's only so much tension that the backside then can produce to resist it. So, you know, what I was noticing was it was very easy to get really good outcomes from people by simply adding in some strategies that would account for movement asymmetries and potentially some strength deficiencies as well. But it was not like a one-size-fits-all approach. It was more of an approach of we look at the person that's in front of us and go, okay, well, what do they need in terms of movement so that they don't have to fight themselves to do something? If we look at a squat, if you were really, really tight in the glute or the back of the hip, it would make it really hard to get down and get into depth. So what could we do to just mitigate that? How could we reduce that stiffness so that we could get into the bottom of the squat? Just thinking of it simply like that. You know, this then really sparked my curiosity of, you know, how these changes then should probably be applied to a bigger lens in terms of physio and then long-term training, right? So I think what I'm leading to for today is I really want to just go over a little bit of a framework as to why we get injuries, because quite frankly, they suck, they're annoying, no one wants them, everyone wants to be in the gym training because that's the thing we need to be doing. But there's some really easy ways to just identify if you're at a potential risk of an injury and then sort of our plan to sort of mitigate those through the training process, and some really like practical strategies that we can sort of go about this. Now, that's today's episode, so let's dig in. Now, the first big topic that I sort of want to delve into is why most injuries happen. I think probably the lens to look at this is nothing ever happens in isolation. The human body has a really cool thing that happens that will always get the job done if humanly possible. Even if that is at your detriment. We are survivors. We'll figure out a strategy to get things done. But if we look at that from, you know, say a movement standpoint, if we have a really tight hip, for instance, if I can't move through my hip, I'm then going to compensate and I'm going to try and use other structures or other areas to create that movement. Now, from performing a particular task, that's a great thing. But if we look at movement, we look at pain, we look at injury, and we look at, you know, overall training performance, that actually can lead to detrimental results. So I think having a look at it, we are designed to move as humans. We're not overly designed to be sedentary. We're meant to be moving, and if we have a look at, you know, even the recommended daily movement and exercise that we should be doing for ourselves, the bar for that is really, really low, like really way too low. So what we need to be doing is we need to be moving intentfully every single day. And it's not just training. Like, we need to be stretching, we need to be mobilizing, we need to make sure that we have range of movement and access to get into positions that we want to train. Often when we look at training, for instance, we only kind of come into training and then warm up for a training session or a movement pattern, and that's it. But really, we're designed to move outside of that as well. We're designed to reciprocate, locomotion, walking, running, all these things. But often we're just so sort of trapped in this narrow box of movement, which really becomes quite an issue because you become quite fragile. Anything outside of this really kind of, front to back, seated position, standing position becomes really limited. And, say for instance, I have to step to the side, all of a sudden my adductor's twinged or my back's gone and I've got some pain. And it's really just because we haven't got that much exposure to different movement patterns and movement planes. So I think first and foremost, we actually should just be moving more so than anything else. It's just, it's what we do as humans and is what we're designed to do. Now, even for me, for instance, I never had any pain, any sort of back pain, knee pain, hip pain, any of that until I actually spent more time sitting down. And, that just the action of sitting down for long periods of time is enough to then start to change your structure. So we're designed to move. Now, this is another one, is for every action we do, for every type of stimulus we provide the body, there's an opposite to it. So if we were to do 1,000 leg extensions, for instance, just to keep it practical, if we were to do 1,000 leg extensions, over time we would actually build an asymmetry, a functional imbalance in the quads to the knees. So for everything that we do, we should be looking at a training program across a week, across a block, across a year, and we should be looking at the system as a whole and going, how can we create structural balance within the entire system? How can we pull these levers throughout a training block and a year to make sure that the person that you're working with, or yourself, if you're self-coaching, can actually plan your year out in a way that keeps you working in a functional way. Now, if we have a look at the human system, we cannot train every component at once. Like, we can't train stability. We can't train isolated muscle movements. We can't train the big compounds. So we need to have a bigger system and an ecosystem that we work within in order to actually, periodize it or plan it out across a year. So we need to account for these things. Now, in the training sense or in a rehab sense, I always talk about it from sort of like a bottoms-up approach. And we want to train movements. We don't necessarily want to train just muscles. We want to train movements and patterns. So if I'm doing a lot of hip flexion, I would want to equal the opposite side with hip extension. So you want to always just be thinking about, like with your training programs or when you are training, or if you have an injury that's popped up, what could be potentially moving? Now, I'm going to give a couple of really practical examples here. If we look at powerlifting, for instance, and strength training, squat, bench, deadlift, a lot of the movements that we do are actually overhand, right? So we don't get exposure to a lot of underhand grip work. So as part of your training year, it might not be just as things are getting really, really heavy, but there's got to be part of the year that accounts for, we call this supination, the hand up grip, because that's going to train a whole different pattern, a complete different pattern of muscles, and it's also then going to help to create balance at the joint and within the muscles themselves, because whatever position you're in for long periods of time, your body will just adapt to. So then anytime, like I was saying in the first point, anytime we get exposure outside of that, we become quite fragile. So we just need to sort of keep that in mind, that every action or every training movement that we do, there's always an opposite to that. And then throughout your actual week, like what can you factor into your training program or your day that's just movement? Like go for a walk, go for a swim, do anything that is just movement, because it's essentially what we're designed to do. Now, the other side of this is when we get an injury, it's really quite frustrating, and often the point of an injury that we have, we feel it somewhere, but it's often like quite far away from actually where the pain originates from. So if we have a look at the back, for instance, a nerve or a disc-based issue, often you'll feel, say, pain in the foot or in the calf or the hamstring. And really, it's actually originated from, say, the back, from a disc. And there's pressure on the actual nerve root that's then sending a signal down your leg. So often we sort of think about these pain and we're like, oh, like my knee's really, really sore. But we also need to sort of zoom out a little bit as well. And we need to go, well, like, why is my knee sore? And I think, sometimes like as a practitioner, as a coach, we get so sort of dialed in on like this one thing. We want to find a solution for it, but often we need to kind of actually take a bigger step backwards, and we need to look back at the bigger picture and go, okay, what's happening at the ankle? What's happening at the hip? What's happening in terms of training technique? So this is a really big catalyst. Like, with everyone that sits down for work, you're spending so much time in these seated positions. The front of your hips, it's inevitable, are going to get tight. You might have a grace period until you're 30, 35, 40, but there will be a point in time where you actually start to experience pain. I know that sounds a little bit grim, but it's just because your body over time is actually going to adapt to those positions. There's no way around it. It has to. It's part of our survival mechanism. So you're going to end up building up these tension spots. And it's okay in, your earlier years, you can get on with it, but there will be a point where it hurts. And it's at that point that people go, like, how have I gotten here? Like, how have I ended up in this point? And, we could blame, sitting, but the reality is we need to sit. We need to do things in order to work and build careers and, the life and the lifestyle that we want. But we also need to start to take a bigger picture look at it and go, okay, well, what can I do in my day to day? If I'm feeling it in my knee, well, surely there's some very simple strategies that I can do to work on hip mobility, work on ankle mobility, to make sure that I'm moving well. I think that's just something that is often overlooked, is just baseline movement. There's certain areas. There's a model that was put together by Mike Boyle and Gray Cook, I believe, and it's called the joint by joint approach. And it just kind of looks at the body in a way that it stacks it on top of one another. So if we look, let's just start at the neck. The neck is a joint that has a lot of range of movement, but it is essentially a stabilizing joint. So it shouldn't be necessarily performing the movements, but it can. Then if we go down to the rib cage, its job is it's rigid, but it's designed to rotate, extend, flex, and move. So often you get people that come in with neck pain, and what ends up happening is they're using their head and their neck more than what they should be because they haven't got the available range of movement at the rib cage. So then for that person, you would want to work on a strategy of getting the rib cage moving to then take some tension off the neck. But that whole model that I was speaking about, the joint by joint, goes all the way down the body. So if you go from the ribs and then you go to the lower back, again, the lower back can move, but should it? Right? Like, should it move as much as, say, the rib cage or the hip? No, it shouldn't. It has the available movement, and you should be able to get and, use that movement, but it shouldn't be your main driver. Like, if we look at a hinge or a deadlift pattern, for instance, we should be loading the hamstrings, we should be loading the glutes, we should be doing it in a way that's keeping the back in a somewhat of a neutral position. We don't want to put any excess stress on, like, the structures in the back. But in saying that, you shouldn't be so fragile and so locked into that position that you can't step outside of that position as well. So, that's over the last, say, 5 years or so, there's been a bit more of a lean in towards like loaded mobility and loaded movements. So in this instance, training something such as a Jefferson's curl alongside of actually your hinge work is something that creates a little bit more of a robust pattern. Now, you're obviously not going to Jefferson curl the same amount that you deadlift, but it's just saying it's like we also need to get exposure to movement patterns outside of just the training pattern so that we don't become fragile. Now, most injuries happen, and I'm going to make a mad blanket statement here. Most injuries happen, one, because we don't have the available range. We don't have the required movement to do an activity or a task that we need to do. And then the second component of that is massively just because we overload things too much too soon, whether that's in terms of training volume or that's in terms of actual intensity. So if we relate that to a bodybuilder, they just go from doing 1 set a week to 20 sets a week. Or if we look at someone that's squatting and they've just started squatting and they started off at 60 kilos and all of a sudden they've loaded 200 on the bar. It's not a logical progression. Their body hasn't had enough time to adapt to the stimulus and build up the sets and reps in order to earn the right to continue to add load or weight. So then the third big one is structural balance. Like, there's no way around it. there is a big movement for keeping training simple, and I do get that. Let's not overcomplicate it. But the reality is, the longer you go on in your journey, the longer you go through the training process, the more you'll realize that there's nothing more frustrating than being sidelined because of pain. And in a lot of cases, it's actually something that you can work towards, and that's structural balance. So making sure that you're working really well from front to back, side to side, up and down, and everything in between. It doesn't mean that you have to have 100% capacity of every movement, but it just means that you should be able to train it, and you should be able to get into certain positions without there being a detrimental side to that. Like, if every time I turn to my palmar, my elbow hurt, there is something inherently wrong with the way that that joint moves and the muscles are acting around the elbow. So we'd want to make sure that we address that at some point during that training process. Now, the next component that everyone probably wants to know is, how do I reduce the chances of my injuries over time? And it's a serious question, and I did allude to it before, that there's no real way of ever preventing an injury, like fully. Sometimes things just happen. It's unfortunate. It is what it is. But there's a lot that you can do in terms of managing variables and controlling things. There's a lot that you can do in your day-to-day when you're training, outside of training, how you're recovering, how you're fueling yourself, to actually just make sure you're ticking a lot of boxes. And then if something is to happen, you go, well, look, I did all the 1%ers. I did all the things that I possibly could, and now this is just part of the training process that I need to work through. Now, I think probably the biggest one that I've noticed over time is, I review a lot of people's training programs, whether it's from sort of like a rehab stance or new clients that are onboarding. And I think often we have this idea of training, and we train it as either lifts or movements. Like body parts, where really we should be looking at it as movements. So when I look at training, I really go like, what movements are we training, and what is the opposite of that? If all I did was squat, bench, and dead over and over and over again, and I didn't really put much work or effort into my accessory exercises, I'm training 3 patterns constantly. And there is a lot of imbalance in training like that. If I'm doing a big compound squat movement and then I'm doing deadlifts, I'm training the hip hinge, I'm training the squat pattern, but there's a huge component of the posterior chain at the hamstrings, at the calf, that I'm not training. There's a huge component at the quad that I'm not training in terms of straightening the knee out, terminal knee extension. If we look at bench press, we're never really getting exposure to these more flex positions where we're really bringing our arm forward and getting that bunching of the pec. We're not really training our shoulders. So there's a lot of movement patterns that we're missing. So when we look at training programs, one of the biggest things that we can do is actually start to look at the training program and go, well, how do we look at this program in terms of movements? So how I actually like to do it is I go, well, I've got my main movements, so say my squat, my bench, my deadlift, my presses, my pulls, all of that stuff, and then using your accessory exercises as an opportunity to then create structural balance within your training program. It's such a logical way to look at training, because you go, okay, well, I can still have the specificity of what I'm trying to work towards, whether it's strength training, muscle building, power training, like a concurrent style training program, doesn't matter what it is, and you can account for that in your specific lifts, and then we can look at your accessory exercises and look to create balance. And if we look at it from, structural balance is the term that I always use, but really it's looking at injury prevention and also making sure that you can stay in the game for the longest period of time. So looking at training as a lens, as a whole, of movements, not just muscle groups. I think, back in the day, we used to sort of train body parts and splits a lot more, where we would, we'll train chest and shoulders, we would train back and buys, and that's all good. Don't get me wrong, it works, everything works, but, contextually speaking, when you have been training for a long period of time, it doesn't really matter how you train. You just want to train in a way that you get a good return on your investment for all the effort that you're actually putting in. And if that means actually having a slightly bigger lens where we're looking at things from a movement standpoint, I just think that's such a smart way of looking at it. Now, in saying that, we also then need to look at it in a way that we periodize this across a year. We can't focus on everything at once. So, it really depends what sort of training that you do. And, I love giving context around this sort of stuff. Like, the whole ecosystem that I work within it's the same ecosystem, it's the same message, but it's looking at training and going, you can have specific goals and you can work towards specific outcomes, whether it's building muscle, building strength, power, lifestyle focus, and you can do this in an ecosystem whilst also working on movement. As a physio, I see the back end of this and I see how frustrating it is for lifters, people that are active, and they just want to get good results in the gym. And there's nothing more frustrating. So if we sort of zoom out a little bit, we go, well, how do we periodize this across a year to minimize our chances of injury? And I would say you've got to look at it from this movement-based lens, and we go, okay, well, what are all the different ways that we can train? We can train isolated muscle groups. We can train that where we do one leg or one arm at a time versus two legs or two arms at a time. We can train things in a unilateral fashion. So if we look at the legs, we can do it with both feet on the ground, that would be supported, or 1 foot on the ground, which would be unsupported. So we've got all these different types of movement patterns that we can train. But we've got to look at it in a way that, how do we do that in a sequential way that's super, super logical across a year that makes sense? But then also taking into account what the bigger goals are. So let's use powerlifting because I think it's just a really great example here. We've got the squat, bench and deadlift that we need to get better at. We need to get stronger at. We need to build specific muscle for. We need to do enough sets and reps and work that it builds the skill and it builds our ability to lift heavier weights. It's a pretty simple sport. Outside of that, the rest is up to you, right? So we could go at the very, very start of a training block, we could go, okay, well, we're just going to work on the smaller isolated muscles. We're going to do all the small, rear delts, chest flies, lateral raises, bicep, tricep work, rotator cuff work, forearm work, grip work in different positions. We can train everything in isolation. Then we apply that to the lower body as well, obviously, but we can train the entire body in parts whilst we're working these bigger movement patterns in, say, your main lift and your supplementary lifts for the day. Then we can move into isolated or unilateral based movements where we isolate certain areas or movement patterns. So it might be a single leg squat or a split squat or a rear foot squat. And we can do the same with the posterior chain. We can do hip thrust, staggered stance. We can do staggered stance RDLs. We've got all these varieties of exercises that actually do fit in the ecosystem. It's just a matter of planning it. But then we can move from the unilateral stuff, we can move into, say, compound machine-based work. So you can see you've gone from lighter, you've gotten slightly heavier with the unilateral, but you're challenging the system as a whole. Then we move it into something that's a little bit more dense, which is machine-based work. Now, the cool thing with this is it's really going to help you to have support and stability from the machines, which means that you can then sort of push into a little bit more of a hypertrophy effect because you can push closer to that failure point. And then if we look at powerlifting, our goal is to lift heavy weights. So the next category up with your accessory exercises can be big movements that directly have a carryover to the main lifts themselves. Now, if you look at it, it's like small groups, using it to create a symmetrical balance, then you're using that muscle mass, that balance that you've created in the first two phases or the first two chunks of time, and then you're making and building muscle on top of that, and then you're making it strong. So there's so many easy ways that you can factor this in. And, I think over time, I've really tried to move away from the keep it simple and, looking at a training program that I put together, you would look at it and you go, yeah, that's really simple. But it's simplicity because it has been reduced down to simplicity. And it's just meaning that it's accounting for things across a year. So using your accessory exercises is an absolute tool that should be employed by every single person. Now, not everyone as well in the gym is actually going to look at training like this. Some people aren't really that interested in strength. Some people aren't that interested in building a huge amount of muscle mass. They want to train in a way that supports their life so they can work towards longevity, they can work towards being mobile, being fit, being healthy for their family, and everything in between, right? So not everyone is going to have these specific outcomes. So instead of having main lifts, you would simply just phase through these training programs as they are. You don't need to have main lifts. So you could just go through the exact same structure that I spoke about, just without main lifts. It just means that you may get the luxury of having a couple more exercises per session. And then that also then frees up more bandwidth and more room throughout the training week to do, say, more aerobic work or mobility work. Or if someone has been dealing with pain, for a really long period of time, having a program that actually really just accounts for movement as well as training. Like say for instance, someone had dealt with crippling back pain for really long periods of time, a large part of their accessory work could actually just be loaded mobility work. So you could still do some main lifts to build muscle, build strength, but you use loaded mobility in order to make sure that you're progressing movement and keeping available a range there that you can use in training and life. So this for me is the biggest consideration, is how do you manage this across a year from a training standpoint? Then we need to look at, what you do day to day. So yes, we sit down a lot, and I just don't think that's an excuse for having pain. I think there's so much that we can do. Get up, get moving through the day, have some time that's in your schedule that's non-negotiable for mobility, doing some movement stuff that's really non-specific. I personally choose the night. I think before you go to bed at night, when you're starting to wind down, maybe you've had dinner, you're sitting around with your family and whatnot, and you can sit down and relax and wind down a little bit. It's a really good way just to give back to your body, especially if you have been sitting or you've been training hard that day. And then two, it down-regulates your nervous system as well. So it really puts you into this parasympathetic state where it's really nice and relaxing. So basically, moral of the story, I would say get some baseline movement into your week and your days, if possible, that isn't specific to actual training. When we look at nutrition, recovery, hydration, they're a huge component. That topic in itself is, a whole podcast in itself. But I would say society as a whole, I think if we start to look at our food, we need to start to look at food a little bit more as how it fuels our performance. I had this great conversation with a client during the week, actually. And we were chatting. So when this particular client started working with me, they were really under eating. They were performing at a really high level, but they were really under eating, and they were weight stable in a deficit. Now, there's a lot of people that will make claims and say you can't be weight stable in a deficit. They must be tracking incorrectly. But I think there's a lot more research that's come out now, and I think we're starting to move away from that a little bit. Your thyroid, your metabolism will slow down as a result of you being in a deficit for a really extended period of time. When you are in these deficits for extended period of time, what happens is non-essential functions just get lowered or shut down. Hormone production, skin, nail, hair, all of those things, menstrual cycle, they all get decreased. So I think as a society as a whole, we need to look at food as fuel to help us feel better. Now, this particular client that I was having a conversation with, for instance, we went from, I think it was 1,700 or 1,800 calories up to 2,700 calories across, say, a 3-month period. This client actually dropped down body fat by over a kilo, increased muscle mass and recomp without even a single consideration of recomping. It was just part of training hard and eating to fuel your system. So fueling enough, there is obviously two sides to this. There is an overconsumption side, but there is a side where people that are really performing don't actually fuel and give themselves enough food throughout the day. So recovery has to be part of that with food. Make sure you drink water. Let's not even talk about how silly that is. If you don't drink water, drink water. And then I think sleep is just such an important one. I'm the first to sacrifice my sleep when I'm busy. It's a trade-off that at this point I'm willing to make. But, sleep really does get things going. The detrimental effects of not having enough sleep is a podcast in itself. We need to be sleeping, we need to be recovering. That's where the repair processes happen, and it sets us up for big success. So from a controlling variable standpoint, I think training and movement is obviously huge. But there's a lot that we can do from a lifestyle perspective in terms of food, hydration, recovery that we also need to take into consideration when we're starting to look at this. Now, to wrap things up for this episode, the health and fitness industry has such an ability to make positive impact on people. But I think often it misses the mark. We get really caught up on really from an injury standpoint, really hyper focusing on the actual injury itself. Now, obviously we have to look at the injury and we have to look at what we need to do to manage it. But we often don't zoom out enough. Whether that's a time restraint, financial restraint, whatever the reason, we always need to take an injury and then take a sort of a bigger step backwards and zoom out a little bit and go, okay, well, what's going on here? As a system as a whole, we need to be factoring in training. We have to. If you're a practitioner and you're working with people that are training, we need to have a better understanding of how they train, why they train in a certain way, so that the strategies that we actually help these lifters with has a carryover to their lifting. I think we are way beyond getting a little bit of treatment, getting a little rub, and then see you next time, see you next week. We need to be having better strategies. It's looking at more than just their training. It's looking at their training programs, how they're moving, their technique, but we're also starting to look at other components of their lifestyle that also need to be addressed. If they're eating enough, if they're recovering enough, if they're doing enough baseline movement. But I think we often zoom in so little, and we look at this perfect differential diagnosis of this injury, and we want to make sure that we nail it. But the reality is we also need to zoom out a little bit at some point in time and go, well, what are other considerations here to help this person? You know, the health and fitness industry as a whole, we like to have the answers for things, but often we need to take a step back and look at the person as a whole rather than a small component. From a training standpoint, from a coaching standpoint, I really, really cannot stress this enough. Once you're onboarded into training and you're moving, you need to be working with people that are going to push you in the right direction, that actually take into consideration your goals. Often we default to convenience for training. It's like the local gym or the facility that everyone goes to, rather than going, well, no, what do I actually need to get from my training, and who's the person that I can help with or that can help me get those results. That's what we need to be doing more so than anything else. We need to be making sure that we're aligning our training goals and values with the right people. And often, all the great coaches that I know, the majority of them you can get access to them online somehow, because the reality is not everyone that you need is going to be directly in your suburb or your geolocation. So you need to start to look outside of just the people that are around you. Even if that means, stepping out of your current circle, you need to be looking at people that can help you sort of level up and get to that next level. That's true for everything in life, but in training, there's definitely progressions. If we look at a lot of the semi-private small group training gyms, they're a great asset and tool for a lot of people. It gets people into the gym, but to be completely honest with you, they're no more than just a maintenance program. There's a limit. Some of the gyms have a limit on weights that they have there. There's a limit to the weight that you can progress. There's a limit in exercise and equipment, machines that you can use. So there's going to be a limit to your training. So once you're into the gym, and a lot of people find specialized gyms really daunting. But once you're into the gym and you feel comfortable in that environment, aligning yourself with people that can actually take you to that next level is really, really important. So look, to wrap things up, I think every single person should be training. There's no good, there's no bad training. There's a lot that you can be doing that's better, and there's a lot that you could be doing that's probably worse as well. But from an injury management standpoint, I think we need to be looking at training as a whole, you as a person, training movements, not just looking at specific body parts, and just acknowledging the fact that we're designed to move. We are designed to move. So if you don't have access to positions, there is no way that you're going to be able to train it. And if you do, you're forcing it. Now, every week I put out a podcast and a YouTube. In the show notes, I've got a link to my email. If you want to jump on that, it is the easiest way to stay up to date with all of my content. Thanks for today. I'll see you guys in the next episode.